funded stadiums a home run, or are they a foul play? My name is Michelle, and today I want to talk to you about public versus private spending on sports stadiums. In the last century, some of the largest, most expensive stadiums have been built. These include the Yankee Stadium for $1.5 billion, the MetLife Stadium for $1.6 billion, and the Cowboys Stadium for $1.33 billion. The amount of this spending is absolutely huge. And on top of that, taxpayers are held liable for a large portion of these costs. Some people estimate that about 2/3 of the cost of stadiums built today are funded by taxpayer dollars. And other economists think that this number might be even higher. So as sports fans and taxpayers, we need to decide, are publicly funded stadiums a good idea? I think that the best way to analyze this problem is using some of the principles we learned in economics. To start out our analysis, I want to take a look at the evolution of stadiums over the last century. Prior to 1910, team owners built facilities specifically for the teams that they owned. These stadiums were entirely privately funded. Most of the facilities were created for baseball, but later rented out to other types of sports as well. It didn't take very long for public funds to find their way into stadium construction. A little after 1910, 100% publicly funded stadiums began appearing. The New Deal and the 1932 Olympics got the ball rolling for these publicly funded sports stadiums. This trend of publicly funded stadiums continued as the demand for sports activities increased. It became the norm, just something the government built along with roads and schools. These stadiums eventually evolved into multi-use stadiums, as opposed to the previous single-use facilities. This made them cheaper to produce. However, they weren't really as popular. The unique shape of stadiums was an important part of baseball's tradition, and these cookie-cutter stadiums simply couldn't fit the multiple needs of different sports. So as teams started leaving these stadiums, they tried to get government funding for new, fancier, single-use facilities. The government wasn't willing to just go along with this. This is when the era of mixed funding for sports stadiums began, somewhere around 1980 or 1990. The public began to fund about 66% of sports stadiums. This change was not nearly as extreme as the previous changes. We have 3 different stages of the evolution of sports stadiums. In the first stage, we have entirely privately funded sports stadiums that were single-use facilities, and that was prior to 1910. From 1910 onward, though, we had 100% publicly funded stadiums, and they kind of developed into cookie-cutter stadiums. And finally, we transitioned into a third stage, in which we have mixed funding for stadiums, and they are now single-use and definitely a lot fancier than the original sports stadiums. So how can we take this historical data and our current state and derive meaningful conclusions? This is where we come to economic analysis. Economics teaches us that scarcity surrounds us. There's only so much land, steel, athletes, or electricity available at a particular time. So we need to make sure that these resources are being put to their best possible use. In economics, we compare the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of using a resource in a particular way. That way we know if it is being used in the best possible way. We also don't just look at accounting costs, we look at something called opportunity costs, or the cost of the next best alternative that was foregone. So first, let's take a look at the cost to taxpayers. Economist Judith Long has done a significant amount of research in this area, and her findings are somewhat disheartening. According to her, the true cost to taxpayers is commonly underestimated by economists. This is because some costs, such as the opportunity costs of missed property taxes, costs about the ongoing operation of the facilities, and the true cost of land, are not properly estimated. For example, land costs in the 1960s and 70s were very straightforward, and they were fully included. That's because the stadiums were moving into the suburbs, and land there was fairly cheap, and there was a lot of support for government infrastructure. However, when the stadium started moving back into urban areas, the issue of the cost of land was clouded greatly. That is because of eminent domain and other appraisal issues. So according to Judith Long's findings, the true cost to taxpayers is underestimated by around 40%. That means that the true cost to taxpayers is closer to 79%, as opposed to the previous estimate of 56%. That is up 23 percentage points. That is a significant difference. So if Professor Long is right, the public's dollars are main contributor to these stadium construction funds. So what does this imply about how teams economize on the resources they use when they build stadiums? If only 21% of the stadium cost is shouldered by the team owners, that means that the benefit to the team only needs to be 21% of the stadium's cost. What this means is that a lot of stadiums are going to be unnecessarily large and have a lot of extra amenities. You can see this in reality with the Foxborough Stadium, as mentioned by our textbook, which was built for $6.7 million. A year later, Kansas City built a stadium 8 times more expensive with public funds, and Gillette Stadium was 50 times more expensive. According to Judith Long, approximately 79% of the average stadium cost is paid for by the taxpayer. What benefit is counterbalancing this cost? According to our textbook, there are 2 direct benefits of sports stadiums. This includes any extra money that people may spend as opposed to save. In economic terms, this means that the stadium increased the average propensity to consume and decreased the average savings. This increase in spending will up the area's GDP. However, savings are also an important part of economic well-being and growth. So it's not an entirely positive change. If you think of a particular location and as its own economy, a new stadium may affect the net exports of the area. It may cause the city's net exports to increase if it attracts consumers from nearby cities. However, if some of the inputs are imported, such as athletes, that would counterbalance the effect. Both of these direct benefits are very hard to pin down and can be easily overstated. This situation calls into mind economist Henry Hazlitt's concept of what is seen and what is not seen. It is impossible to know for sure how people would have acted had the stadium not been built, or not built with taxpayer dollars. That means that you can't estimate accurately the impact of the stadium. You don't know what could have been. One possibility is that the economy was already operating at its full capacity, and that by building the stadium, the economy could no longer take on other projects. The stadium could have crowded out other investments. So the benefit of having the stadium is very hard to estimate and is undoubtedly unclear. So what are the positive externalities? One of the main positive externalities commonly cited is civic pride and a general happy feeling about having a stadium. People tend to think that having this stadium might make the city seem like a larger city, might bring in some businesses, or create a nice revitalized community feeling. This would be a true public good, and that it would be non-excludable. So should the government fix this externality by subsidizing stadiums? That would depend on just how big of a benefit this civic pride is. Economists Whitehead, Gruthis, and Johnson found that only a minority supported public funding of stadiums in their case study. That means that this is a classic example in public choice of concentrated interests creating an outcome that is not actually desired by most people. Economists seem to agree that the benefits of having a new stadium do not materialize into increased financial gain. The new stadium won't make a significant impact on employment, wages, or income. So overall, the main positive externality is simply positive feelings about the city. Is that worth the big price tag? In a world of perfect information, we could take a look at the supply and demand curves and find the optimal level of spending on stadiums. The negative externalities would shift supply, and the positive externalities would shift demand. The magnitude of these externalities would determine where the equilibrium level of spending would occur. To continue our analysis, we need to take a look at the costs that the firm does not take into consideration when it decides to build a stadium and when it sets ticket prices. These costs are externalities. They are borne by other people aside from the stadium or team owners. So the common negative externalities are such things as pollution, crime, and most of all, congestion. Anyone that lives near a stadium has experienced this at some point. These externalities are extremely commonplace, but there is no market price for them. So these elements are not factored into the decision when people build the stadium. So the resources may be allocated in a way that is inefficient because not all the costs are being felt. One of the externalities that is possibly good, possibly bad, is that of changes in property value. Economists have noticed that property values close to a stadium when it's going to be built go down slightly, and usually in proportion to the expected increase in taxation to fund the stadium. But on a bigger scale in the whole city, the property values might increase slightly. So whether or not this is a positive, negative, or neutral externality depends on these magnitudes, and it seems to be different on a case-by-case basis. But what is clearly known is that there are negative externalities associated with stadiums that include pollution, congestion, and crime.